Good to see you. Let's head on up.
All right.
During this global pandemic and era of social distancing, I spoke with Jennifer from our studios in Washington, D.C. She is the Chief Executive Officer of the Nature Conservancy, a global environmental nonprofit based in neighboring Virginia.
The Nature Conservancy is 70 years old this year. We started in 1951 by a group of wonderfully passionate New Yorkers who wanted to buy a piece of land near them to protect it so that it wouldn't be developed into housing. And that small initiative really spawned a movement that is now the Nature Conservancy, that commitment to volunteerism, to protection and restoration of our natural world has really fueled the organization over the last 70 years. Now going from that small one project in New York, we have over 1 million supporters. We have 4,000 employees. We're working in every single state in the United States, and we're also in 70 countries directly working with partners as well as offices on the ground. So it's just grown into an incredible movement, and it all started 70 years ago here in the United States.
Let's talk a little bit about nature and the pandemic, because I watched an interview with you, and I thought this was really interesting because I think the interview brought up a really important subject, which is nature during the pandemic. You know, I would go to the gym. You can't go to the gym now. So my wife and I, we go out for walks all the time, and now we see a lot more foliage. We see a lot more of the people in our community as well, because everybody's out walking and kind of embracing the environment. You know, we've talked about the downside, but is there a plus to the pandemic in that sense that maybe people now are kind of maybe more appreciative of what's around them?
Yes. So I would say that what the pandemic has brought us in terms of the direct relationship with nature is that people realize our relationship with nature is actually quite broken. We know that zoonotic diseases coming from animals were a direct result of the pandemic. So people, I think, are really recognizing that connection between human health and nature when our relationship is broken, as well as what we can earn and get and really thrive when we experience the natural world, both in our cities and our parks, but of course as well in rural areas, and that connection there that's so important. I mean, for example, the World Health Organization has said the most important thing to ensure that we recover from this pandemic and prevent the next one is to protect nature. That's the World Health Organization. So that connection, I think, has never been stronger, and people are really realizing that it's critical that we restore balance in our world, that we recognize the role that the preservation, the conservation of nature can play in protecting not just our beautiful natural world, but ourselves.
Jennifer has spent the past 25 years dedicated to protecting nature. Projects have included partnerships with a range of groups, from global corporations to indigenous communities.
I think I saw you say in one of your addresses that 1 million species are threatened. I mean, I don't think people think about that. Talk to us about it. I mean, it's difficult to get people to wrap their arms around it, isn't it? How do you do that?
Yeah, so I think the pandemic has really brought this home for a lot of people, especially people who are understanding and recognizing that connection between when we're destroying our natural world and we're getting too close to animals, if we're eating those animals, or we're factory farming and other types of systems are also creating a proximity for humans with nature that is really unhealthy. It is home for so many people now. It is a visceral reaction to what's happening, and understanding those connections of biodiversity and protecting biodiversity and how that connects to ensuring that humans are healthy, that we maintain our parks and cities as well as our national parks and regional parks that contain a lot of that, what we call biodiversity, or that are those critical areas and critical species that bring us everything that we enjoy, from the crops that our farmers provide for us and the pollinators from those natural areas that provide those crops to thrive. All of these things are about our natural world and preserving biodiversity. And it's not just the species themselves, it's also we like to think of some of these parks as water factories, these places where water and pollinators can thrive. And when we break down those areas, they hurt us. They hurt food production. They hurt our ability to get clean water in places like China and many other places in the world. So that's what I think for people to understand. It's not just about species, it's about us. We're part of that natural world. And understanding those connections is really critical.
Connections, climate, two C words. I'll bring up another one, which is collaboration. It was interesting, I've seen you talk about this. I had a good friend of mine who was in the International Relief Organization, and he wanted to partner with another one, and they were like, why would we partner with you? You know, we're going after the same dollars. And I've heard you talk about this, that there are a lot of actors in the environmental arena, and this thought of collaboration was just, but now I think the urgency has changed that, hasn't it?
Absolutely. So we like to call it radical collaboration. We don't have time to go alone. We really don't. You know, there's a South African proverb that if you want to not go very far, you go alone. If you want to go far, you go together. And we're bringing that ethos into all of our work as a community now. Not everywhere, but I would say there's been some phenomenal exchanges, collaborations between former competitors now. We're seeing around ocean conservation, for example, around big-scale terrestrial collaborations between organizations that would compete for scarce dollars are really coming together, recognizing that this is the decade of collaboration. If we don't work together, we're not going to go far enough. We're not going to go fast enough that the urgency of the crisis requires. I would also say that it's not just working within the environmental or the NGO space. It's working with companies. It's working with communities, with indigenous communities, with corporations that you would think it would be just crazy for an environmental organization to work with. But we have to do that because the scale of the need, the urgency is such that we cannot go it alone.
Instead of building seawalls, reservoirs, and dams, nature-based solutions use alternative and non-traditional approaches to environmental issues, like flooding or soil erosion by harnessing natural capital.
The importance of nature-based solutions to conservation efforts. Talk to us about that.
Sure. So nature-based solutions is basically the concept that nature itself holds so many solutions for the climate crisis. So for example, if we were able to protect nature, restore nature, and really improve our management of nature, we'd be able to solve about 30% of the climate crisis. To put it at a very fine point on it, if we all stopped using fossil fuels tomorrow and our emissions went to zero, and we did nothing about how we use land, how we farm, how we get our wood from forests, we would never achieve the Paris targets. And that's simply because around 27% of emissions on an annual basis is coming from the destruction of the natural world. So we think that improving, restoring, and protecting nature will enable us to actually achieve those Paris targets in a much more accelerated way. We have to do everything we're doing on changing the way we produce energy, of course, and how we get our cement and many other things that we all enjoy as humans. But if we don't change that engagement with nature, that protection of nature and restoration and management of nature, we will never be able to be on the pathway for change in our planet. So one of the examples of a nature-based solution is, let's take soil, for example. It's often seen as sort of a forgotten solution. Now, our scientists estimate that about 10% of annual emissions could be reduced if we change the way that we produce food. There's so much soil that's really important soil that's lost every year as a direct result of how we're doing farming. So one of the things that the Nature Conservancy is doing here in the US as well as in countries like Brazil is to emphasize and promote what's called regenerative farming practices. So that's trying to keep as much of that critical topsoil that holds carbon in the soil standing as opposed to being released through farming practices. Now, farmers need to be incentivized to do that. It costs money. There's decreases in productivity in the short term. So we're doing something called soil carbon crediting and helping those farmers to have an incentive to change their production practices by giving them an investment over time until those production practices can earn enough money for those farmers. So that's just one example of a nature-based solution.
With its international experience, the Nature Conservancy offers incentive programs to help sustain clean water supplies in cities around the world, including Asia. In China, cities like Shenzhen, with a population of more than 12 million, are being transformed into healthier places to live.
We're doing a lot of work in water, especially in China and many places. And water and the ability for water to continuously be clean as well as come from natural sources and be prolific in many countries requires an investment upstream. So let's take a big city in China like Shenzhen. So in a city like that, we've helped the community in Shenzhen, the municipal leaders there, to understand the linkages between clean water and clean and protected upstream natural ecosystems to water that's coming into the city. And we've helped develop something called a water fund. And we're doing this in many cities around the world. And that's basically giving incentives to upstream natural resource farmers, for example, to not cut down trees when they're doing their farming, because that has a direct link to the water quality that's coming into the city of Shenzhen for a very large population. So those are a few examples. Another one is around restoration. So reforestation, we're part of a billion trees and actually a trillion tree effort as well to plant 1 trillion trees. And trees are so important for human health, as we know, as you mentioned, going out walking with your family and getting the incredible benefits that tree covers can provide. But it's also really critical for carbon. So if we are able to plant more trees and bring life back to land, it's not just about planting trees. And of course, they have to be the right kind of trees in the right places, but really bringing life back to land, we can enable Mother Nature to realize her potential to protect our climate.
Almost 30 years ago, Jennifer was teaching in Southwest Africa, planning on a career in public health. But after years of working and living in a small community, she discovered the direct link between a healthy environment and a person's health.
So Jennifer, one of the things I always like to do is watch interviews with people before I interview them. And it was so great to watch you talking about Namibia, because your face just came alive talking about your past and stuff. So talk to us about that experience.
Sure. So when I was in my early 20s, I moved to Namibia, northern Namibia, to work on a women's education project. I actually went there thinking I was gonna do this great 2 years of my life and then go to public health school back in the US. And I would spend my days working with a women's organization, and I would spend my afternoons and my weekends going to the farms and spending time with the families. And as I got to know people, I would, on the weekends we would go and we would collect firewood for fuel, and we would go and dig boreholes. And the area where we lived in the north, right on the border of Angola, was very, very dry and had been increasingly becoming drought prone and drought stricken over the past really 30, 40 years. And one night I was sitting with my dear friend Ria under a beautiful full moon, and we were talking about her childhood, and she went in the back room and came back and brought me a photo album, pictures of her when she was a kid at the same place where we were sitting that had no trees, but the pictures were just full of trees and just beautiful, lush landscape. And I said to her, what's happened here? And she said, well, we've cut down the trees for firewood because we had no alternative. And when I was young, there would be birds and wildlife around, and now there's none of that. And she said that when they would go collect water when she was young, it wouldn't take them very long. They could easily find water. When she was an adult, when I was there, we would spend hours going to try to find water and firewood. And she said, this is my life now.
Wow.
It's spending all of my time trying to get just basic resources for my family.
That's heartbreaking.
It's heartbreaking, and it was also a real kind of aha moment for me. And I thought, maybe instead of focusing on public health, I should look and try to help Ria and families like her all over the world to address environmental degradation, helping with better energy sources, as well as better opportunities to preserve nature. And so I changed my mind about going into public health and decided to study economics and environment and business for my career.
No nation can solve this crisis on our own, as I know you all fully understand. All of us, and particularly those of us who represent the world's largest economies, we have to step up.
In April 2021, 40 world leaders met during a virtual leader summit on climate. Several countries, including the U.S., announced ambitious new climate targets to reduce emissions in an effort to keep the planet's temperature within 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial times. That's the level scientists say is needed to avoid the most severe effects of climate change.
Are we kind of frozen where we don't want to do anything, or we do want to do something, but we don't know how because it's just too complicated? And when you approach, farmers or governments and say, look, this is our plan, do they just sit there and go, oh, this is going to be too hard to do? I mean, what are some of the things that you run up against?
So I would say that you have to just start. And I think you can't get paralyzed by complexity. And that's something that the Nature Conservancy has really been focusing on, is how do we meet people where they are, but also make sure that we're pushing them to see a better future. And how do we do that in a way that's practical, that is incentive-based, meaning that you're actually being able to help with financial incentives. You can't just expect people a farmer, let's say in Iowa, to wake up one day and say, well, my daughter has been telling me I need to be better, so I'm going to completely transform my farm. Some maybe have the luxury of doing that, but many won't. And so how do we create solutions which will enable them to get on that path in the long term? Or whether it's a logger in Indonesia, for example, they're just trying to put food on the table for their family. So how do we work with them in ways where we can harness the power of markets and financial incentives and help them to change? It won't be overnight, but we can do that, I know, with the market forces that we're seeing, with governments coming on board, with companies demanding products that are produced sustainably. And that's all coming together and really enabling us on the ground to make the change that we need. But we have to start. We can't get overwhelmed and think that it's too much, it's too complicated, because every solution requires that first step and that engagement in a way that's smart and practical. And that's why the Nature Conservancy hires people from those communities that can sit down and speak in their own language and their own dialects and come up with locally grown solutions. That's the key to any change.
So working with indigenous groups is really important.
Yes.
Because they understand.
Well, not only is there understanding, but I think importantly there's power there. So indigenous people across the world manage or steward almost 25% of our planet. In places like Brazil, it's even higher. And they're sitting on 17% of the world's natural carbon. So they're an incredibly important stakeholder. So we are working very closely with indigenous groups from Australia to Canada, First Nations, all over the world, to help them have a seat at the table, to enable them to have the financial and technical resources to protect their lands, and to push for governments to recognize the importance of their role as stewards of the environment. So it's incredibly important that we get this right. It's incredibly important that we as non-Indigenous people don't go in and tell Indigenous people what to do, but we listen to them, we hear their stories, and the ones that want to actually maintain their lands over time and continue those cultural traditions, we can help them do that.
Thanks so much.